They were returning home from a clean and sober New Year's Eve party at the convention center in Portland
Mm.
when they were struck and killed by a drunk driver. And the columnist, he had highlighted he called it a palpable irony, which is what I named my first book, Palpable Irony, for that reason. He said it is a palpable irony that the folks who had devoted their lives to help people get clean and sober would have theirs cut short by a drunk driver.
Mm.
And then he said something at the end of that article that changed my life forever and set everything into motion for the next, what would be 17 and a half years in prison. He said, perhaps the person they will have ended up helping the most is the man who's charged with killing them.
Well, welcome back to the Stacking Days podcast, where we highlight underrepresented journeys of sobriety. I'm your host, as always, Ray Donovan, and I'm extremely excited today because we have a brother who's coming on that I've been following for quite some time. It's funny, we talked a little bit before the episode, and he was wondering why I hadn't reached out to him sooner. And that's partially because I just look at how busy he is, and I didn't want to impede on any of the good work that he's doing. But I was in a little bit of a bind recently from the standpoint of getting guests on, and I reached out to Martin, and he just said 100% I'm in. And so I'm so excited to have you on, Martin, to chat about your story, man. Thank you so much to joining us here on Stacking Days.
Absolutely, Ray. The pleasure is all mine. And again, it's been a long time coming for me to be on this podcast, and I'm just honored to be here today.
Thank you, brother. Thank you. So let's get right into it. Let's go all the way back to the beginning. Looking, in the rearview mirror on where your relationship with alcohol started, and if there were some pieces that kind of predated that first sip, feel free to share, and then we'll kind of get into your story chronologically from there.
Absolutely. So I'm actually going to share something here that I've actually not shared, frankly, on any podcast or in any public setting. But I think it's apropos here on this BIPOC podcast and platform. So I grew up, just for context, I grew up in Portland, Oregon in the 80s.
Mm,
And I know a lot of people, when they think about Portland, if they've never been there today, they think about Portland as keep Portland weird mantra. And, we have the naked bike rides. And Portland has been very much gentrified over the last 2 or 3 decades. And so let me just say at that time, it was a very different Portland.
mm,
They had gangs coming up from California. I remember, in the early 80s, there were certain gang members, really big name gang members that I had never heard of. And then I heard, oh, they're from California and they're coming up kind of trying to claim this space in the
mm,
inner city of Northeast Portland. So there was a lot of drive-by shootings. There was prostitution that was rampant. There was the crack epidemic that hit America, Black America. And so there was that, right?
mm,
However, my parents were very loving and nurturing, and so my dad had my twin brother and me. He had us in Little League Baseball. We played for 5 years. We played Pop Warner football. He had us in the wrestling. He had us in Cub Scouts. And this Cub Scouts part of my life, if you will, was where things started to look a little different for me in terms of how I came to understand my blackness or to see my blackness. And
mm,
so to kind of flesh that out, so our Cub Scout meetings would take place about 15 minutes from where we lived. And 15 minutes away was a middle class, predominantly white neighborhood. And so I remember we would drive to those neighborhoods and it was night and day. There were manicured lawns. The streets and sidewalks were free of trash. They had newer vehicles in their driveways. Their houses were clean and smelled really good, like freshly baked cookies. I mean, it was like this utopian space that we were entering into.
mm,
And I remember, I was maybe like 9 or 10 years old, maybe 11 at the most. And I remember kind of thinking when we would come back from some of those meetings, and in my pre-adolescent brain, the way I processed this contrast between how those folks lived and how we lived, and anybody who looked like me, frankly, was that it had to have meant that something was inherently wrong with me
mm,
and anyone who looked like me if basically every white person that I saw at that time were allowed to live in those pristine neighborhoods,
Mm,
while everyone who looked like myself and my family were confined, frankly, to live in very different conditions.
yeah.
And so that, man, I just remember that starkly, and that kind of, not kind of, it did take a toll on me and how I saw myself. And I think that was kind of the basis of my lack of self esteem, lack of a healthy self concept, and really kind of, it almost put a ceiling on my life in terms of, am I going to be able to be more than this? Can I possibly live in that pristine neighborhood? Could I, get a job that would allow me to, to drive those nice cars and things like that? And frankly, there was nothing around me that would suggest that those things were possible. And I'm
Mm.
like 9 or 10 years old, and so that was kind of the basis for where things would eventually go several years later. So I'll just continue. So
Martin, before you continue, I do want to just like I got to stop there and call this out because you're 8, 9, 10 years old and you're having this existential crisis as a kid around what your potential could look like in life based on the parameters of the world around you. And I think that that's really important to note because that to me is in some ways cultural and unique to people of color who are growing up in these spaces where we look at our parents, we look at our grandparents, we want to succeed, but things around us are constantly telling us that your vision and idea of what that success could look like perhaps is unattainable for you. And to start recognizing that at such a young age when you were just nowhere even close to being fully developed is harsh. It's extremely harsh. So I feel you on that. I mean, I've actually spent some time in Portland in my 20s, and I don't think a lot of folks recognize even like how racially tense Portland, Oregon can be. I remember I was doing door to door sales. I'll make this story real short. I was doing door to door sales. I was selling credit card processing machines to small businesses. So essentially, walking into salons, walking into convenience stores, and selling credit card processors, the things that you swipe credit card on. My territory in Portland happened to be Lake Oswego. And for anybody who knows Lake Oswego, here I am, the 6'1", inch black dude walking around with a suit and tie and a shoulder strap bag around Lake Oswego by myself all day long. Turns out some folks ended up putting calls in on me. That I'm walking around this neighborhood that looks a lot like the neighborhoods that you had just kind of laid out. And come to find out, after the cops showed up, I left very quickly from that neighborhood. I came to find out that Lake Oswego's nickname was Lake No Negro, and when I heard that, I was like, wow. And that's just always stuck in my mind. So when you start talking about your experience as an 8, 9 year old boy being in these spaces that are not for you, that has a lot of impact that resonates with me because I could put myself in your shoes, even though I was there, several decades after you experienced that.
yeah, and just to let you know, Lake Oswego is even more affluent than the neighborhood that we had driven into 15 miles away or 15 minutes away. So I definitely know what you mean when you paint that picture about Lake Oswego, especially at that time. No
Yeah,
question, you experienced racism. Any person
yeah,
of color, frankly, would have, certainly at that time, and frankly even today.
yeah.
So yeah, so that was kind of the very beginning of how I came to see myself. And
Mm,
so moving forward a little bit, but aside from that, things at home were very normal. We had Christmases, we had birthdays, we got new clothes at the beginning of every school year. My dad worked really hard uh, at the shipyards and at Freightliner to take care of the family, a family of six. My mom could not work because she was ill. And so we were by and large taken care of with all the necessities at that time. So around age 14, or at age 14 rather, I was going into high school and I was a terribly shy kid. right? And we know that when we get to high school, like you have to have kids to hang out with. You cannot be a loner. That is basically having a death sentence hanging over your head if you are a loner. So I would basically kind of attach myself to other guys who looked like me, who came from my neighborhood, but I had never met. And I'm thinking my parents probably did everything they could to keep us from mingling with these kids. But these are my guys. They look like me. They come from where I come from. We're the same age. So I'm going to hang out with these guys. And so I remember we had attached ourselves. I say my brother and myself had attached ourselves to another guy who was 1 year older than us, wildly popular. He happened to be a gang member. And we would hang out with him, and he would take us to these parties, and these other kids, 16, 17, 18-year-old kids were there. And I remember he handed my brother and me a beer, and he goes off into the crowd to talk to other kids. And we're looking at each other with these beers in our hands and thinking like, we can't drink these because mom and dad would kill us, right, if they found out. But we also had kind of made the mental calculation, I think, that if we don't drink these beers, that we're not going to be able to hang out with these kids, right? And
Mm.
so I remember cracking that beer. I don't know what kind of beer it was, but I remember taking a few swigs and almost gagged and coughed it up because it was utterly disgusting.
Yeah.
But I remember my chest got warm, so I'm starting to heat up physiologically. And then I remember within a matter of like minutes, it seemed like all my inhibitions came down. My shyness went away. I'm able to, freely talk to people. I'm actually able to talk to girls, which I had not done to that point. It would just terrified me to think about talking to a girl that I thought was cute. And so initially, that was kind of my infatuation with alcohol. And so for the next couple of years, that's kind of how it progressed. So around age 16 is when things started to take a more darker turn. And so again, having that basis of seeing myself as a black kid in America and what that was going to look like. So we know that from a psychosocial standpoint, which I later learned when I got my education, that we go through identity formation between ages 14 and 19. So teenagers will typically start to try on new identities to see which one they could be comfortable in. So like I went from wearing baggy gangster clothes, talking the talk, to fit in with this, with this group that I was hanging out with. And then I remember we had a part time job at an ice cream parlor after school because my parents were big on us kids working hard for our money. I remember we had summer jobs when we were 14 to make money to buy the name brand clothing that we wanted at school
Mm.
time, right? And so we always worked. We had part time jobs after school, and I worked at an ice cream parlor in Northeast Portland. It's not there anymore today, but all of my coworkers were white. And I remember I would hang out with them after work, and we would go shoot pool or go bowling or something like that. And I had a backpack, and I would change into Tommy Hilfiger attire, Ralph Lauren polo, right? These things that symbolize to me middle class, white, greatness,
Yeah.
frankly. And I wanted that so desperately. And so I would hang out with them, wear these clothes, pronounce, all of my INGs, talk the talk to gain their acceptance, right?
Hmm.
To
Hmm.
make me feel that I was somebody more than this inner city black kid living in the hood with no potential to be anything more. And so I'm literally, Ray, literally navigating between two identities. Right, where I would hang out with my homies and talk the talk and be the gangster, sell crack cocaine, carry the handgun, do all of this, and meanwhile I'm also looking to emulate middle class white America because that was where I really wanted to be.
Hmm.
And so I'm struggling internally with this conflict of not knowing who I am, frankly, because neither identity was me, right?
Yep.
So it's very unhealthy identity formation process for me. And frankly, had I had like a therapist or even like a school counselor or somebody to kind of walk me through, or even my parents, God bless them, but that's not the way they grew up with
Yeah.
talking about mental health and psychology and psychosocial development and all these things. And so I am struggling within, and I don't feel there's anywhere to turn. And at that point, alcohol became my best friend. It was a way to, the classic numb your feelings and, kind of get away from it all. And I remember, Ray, I was 16 years old. By this point, I'm a full blown alcoholic. We would go to the corner store before school at 7 o'clock in the morning. We would steal Mad Dog 2020. We would drink it on the way to school. By lunchtime, we were going to buy 40s. We would have people obviously buy it for us. We couldn't buy it ourselves. We'd pay them like a dollar or two, and we could pretty much get anything we wanted in my
Hmm.
neighborhood. And I would drink after school. And I remember I would go home, and it was 4 o'clock in the afternoon. I'm 16 years old. I got a 40 ounce. I would shut my door, lock it, turn on some sad music, some Jodeci or Usher or something sad, and
Hmm.
I would drink this 40 and just look out my window in utter misery
Hmm.
because I am depressed. I feel that I am never going to be anything but what I am now, and frankly, I don't want to deal with that. And
Hmm.
so that was when I knew, and I knew, Ray, I knew at 16, 17 years old that I was dependent on alcohol. It
Hmm.
didn't matter because it got me through my day, and it allowed me to not think about, the bleak outlook that I had on my life at that point.
Yeah. Uh, I feel you on that. I mean, I have also had days where I was drinking Mad Dog 4040 looking out of a window. I mean, when you said that, I just had a flashback. Yeah, man. I mean, that's a very challenging place to be. I think that you what you're saying probably resonates with a bunch of folks who are listening to this, right? That may, and we don't talk about these things out loud. This is a 16-year-old kid dealing with grown man issues, right? And you're sitting there trying to figure out how am I going to manage my way through this thing? And the only effective tool that you can kind of put your hand on, literally and figuratively, is the bottle. So I get it, medicating your way through that pain. And then obviously then you get into this vicious cycle where, the alcohol is actually adding more insult to the injury that that you're already trying to heal from.
Exactly, because I later learned, once I started working on my clinical stuff to get certified as a counselor, that alcohol is a depressant.
Yeah.
Is a depressant, which is why, right, when you first started drinking, you just feel, juiced up and you feel energized and you feel stimulated, and then the longer you drink, you're just a ball of, you're just a mess, right?
Yeah.
You're crying and you're sad and and because it is a depressant. So if you are feeling depressed and you think alcohol is gonna kind of lift you up and make you feel better, it may initially, but the longer you drink, is definitely gonna have that depressant effect. And so that was how things persisted for the next 3 years. So at age 19, my friends and I, by that time, our criminal behavior had escalated from stealing cars, a couple burglaries and things like that had escalated into armed robberies.
Mm.
And so I actually went to prison at 19 for my part actually in setting up that ice cream parlor that I worked at during high
Mm.
school. I set them up to be robbed because I quit on bad terms because I felt that the owner was not treating me fairly because I was black.
Hmm.
And so my way to exact revenge was to set them up to be robbed. And so I set them up. My buddies physically carried out the robbery. Several months later, we were all rounded up, and I ended up taking a plea bargain for that for 5.5 years. I ended up serving 3.5 years, and so I got out when I was 22 years of age. While I was in, I totally made the decision. My family was by my side throughout that time. They came to visit me. They supported me. They encouraged me to get my GED, to turn over a new leaf. So I did that, right? I got my GED. I became a tutor. I'm going to church in prison at the time. But at that time, they didn't have any treatment programs,
Mm.
right? And so I felt that I was doing enough at that point to get out of prison, to get a job, go to school, to put my life together, right? Even though I knew coming in that I had a problem with alcohol, I knew that.
Right.
I just felt that if I did enough other things, maybe, I didn't need a formal treatment program. So I get out at 22 years of age. I return to my parents' house. I immediately got a job at a warehouse, and because I was on supervision, I was required to do 2 nights a week at an outpatient program in downtown Portland. So I did that for 6 months, and then I enrolled in community college courses at Portland Community College because I wanted to become a nurse. And
Hmm.
so these things are going well. I saved up $5,000. I went to an auction. I got my first car. My girlfriend. I met a girl 3 or 4 months out of prison. Moved in with her in Vancouver, Washington. She taught me how to drive. I'm proud. I get my license. I'm paying all my bills. I got a nice car. I'm getting a couple raises at work. I'm going through school. Like, on the surface, everything looked good.
Mm.
However, the issue was that at 22 years of age, 22, 23, you know, I felt like something was missing. I
Hmm.
felt like something was missing because even though I'm doing all these great things, my buddies in the hood, even though I had moved away, they're going to clubs every weekend. They're having house parties, they're doing all this stuff. I felt that I was missing out, right? This what FOMO, I think they call it, fear of missing out.
Yeah.
And so in my brain, because again, I hadn't had any formal treatment or anything like that, I convinced myself that I can still hang out with my guys. These are my guys, right? Childhood
Right.
friends, the ones who didn't go to prison, because frankly, 5 of us had gone to prison for these robberies. And
Mm.
so these guys, so I said, I'm gonna hang out with my guys. I'm not gonna drink, right? I don't want to drink. I'm gonna hang out with them. I'm gonna have a good time, and so I can kind of split the baby, right? But we know that I don't. Most people know the saying: if you hang out in the barbershop long enough, like, you're gonna get a haircut. That's
Yeah.
just what's gonna happen.
Yeah.
So after hanging out a few times, I started to, drink a little bit, and I'm like, oh, I can manage it. I got so much stuff going on in my life that's good. I can,
I
dabble
got
a
I
little
got things
bit.
together.
Absolutely, absolutely. And so, but as an alcoholic, your brain is not going to be satisfied with 1 or 2 drinks. It wants, 15, 20, 30. And so before I know it, at this point now, I am drinking and driving,
Mm.
literally every day, right? And because I never gotten a ticket, I never got pulled over, again, that's confirmation to me that I've got this under control. I'm
Yeah.
doing okay. And I was out for 19 months. And after drinking and driving for 19 months, everything came to a very abrupt, catastrophic halt on New Year's Eve of 2003.
Yeah. And we're going to get into that. And for those who don't know your story, this is almost where a lot of people know your story starts. But clearly, there's always so much that precedes the moment where that one's life takes a turn, right? Either for the better or for the worse. And um but before we get there, first of all, thank you for sharing all of that. I have a couple questions. One, I know that you have a twin brother. I've heard you talk about him on other shows. Was your brother kind of running in parallel with you as far as a lot of activity, behavior, and was he also struggling with a lot of the same internal conflicts that you were feeling at the time?
A very good question. So, number one, yes, we were attached at the hip from, well, throughout life. But when I started to drink at 14, 15, 16, and it escalated, he was right there with me. He got into the same trouble. He was drinking 40s and Mad Dog 2020 and all of that. He changed, however, at 18 years of age. I went to prison at 19, but at 18, he said, I don't want to keep going this way. He went to
Mm.
Job Corps, and he
Okay.
put all of his energy into becoming a carpenter, which he is now a foreman today. He's been in carpentry for what, almost 30 years now. And so that was kind of his fork in the road, and he went that way. So when I went to prison at 19, he had his life very much on track in his apprenticeship, doing what he needed to do, to give himself a chance to succeed. As far as the internal struggles, not at all. My brother and
Mm.
I, even though we're twins, we are very different in that way because I was very superficial. I had to have nice clothes, I had to have the nice car, I had to have the pretty girls, and he just wasn't that way.
Mm.
Like, and he's never been that way. And God bless him. I think that was a buffer for him to not fall into alcoholism, because we drink for different reasons, right? And
Yep.
people become alcoholics, or become addicted to alcohol for different reasons. And so it's not necessarily, I mean, certainly the frequency with which we drink is something to be considered when it comes to assessing whether or not we have a problem with alcohol or not. But really getting to understand the why we drink is really much more critical to understand, in terms of, do I have a healthy relationship with alcohol or not? And
Yeah.
so I was drinking for a very different reason than he was.
I think it's so important to highlight that because we were talking about this before the show. Oftentimes, folks look at the Black community, and you said this, and I agree with you, as a monolith, right? And we are not a monolith within our own community, and we are all individuals. So much so that identical twins are also, experiencing life very differently. You come from the same household, have had the same upbringing, and a lot of the same experiences to a certain point, but your whys are different, right? And for you, it sounds as though that you where you were where you thought you were finding your self-worth may not necessarily align with where your brother even was evaluating where his self-worth was coming from, and that's where the split in the road came from. I always think that's really interesting because I have a sibling who's 2 years younger than me, and we've had a lot of the same experiences growing up. We might as well have been twins, even though we're 2 years apart. And she hasn't suffered from the same dependencies that I have, in her life. So I think it's just important for folks to recognize that there are a lot of similarities out there, but we're all independent people, and our whys are unique to us. And which is why, at the end of the day, sometimes it takes a little more than someone from the outside telling you that you need to step away from it, because those things are so deeply ingrained within who we are as individuals.
Absolutely. No, you're absolutely right. And so, just for clarification, so my brother and I were fraternal twins,
Okay.
but I mean, my mom dressed us alike, as babies and toddlers, and we were always together and doing the same thing. And I mean, he's my best friend, and we are extremely close, and we've always been really, really close. And he supported me through all of these adversities that I frankly, inflicted upon my life. But yeah, we're really, really close, and but very different in many ways.
That's awesome, man. So let's get back on track with your journey here. Walk us through New Year's, and we'll take it from there.
Sure. So it was New Year's Eve of 2003. The day started off like any normal day. So I lived in Vancouver, Washington with my girlfriend, which is about a half hour from Portland, just right over the bridge.
Hmm.
And so I left work at about 6:30 in the morning to be to work on time by 7. Kissed her goodbye, went to work. Now we had gotten off work early because of the holiday, so we got off work at about 11 o'clock that morning. And I remember this, like it was yesterday. We're kind of wrapping things up for the day, and we're ready to clock out. And my boss had just casually joked with us, we're talking about everybody's plans for New Year's Eve. And he was like, "Now you guys go out and have a good time tonight, but, do not end up on the front page of the newspaper." And of course, we chuckled, we laughed it off and clocked out for the day. And, but here we are, little over 20 years later. I've never, ever, ever forgotten those prophetic words. So I
Mm,
left work at 11:30 that morning. I remember I went straight to the liquor store, had $10 in my pocket because we were going to get paid the next day or 2 days later. And so I'm at the end of my pay period, and I take my last $10. I buy a fifth of gin. We called it bumpy face back then because the bottle was kind of bumpy. And
mm,
I went to my parents' house, hang out with my twin brother. He cut my hair because he's a great barber, still is today. But I had to get ready for New Year's Eve. So he's cutting my hair. I'm drinking the alcohol. We're kind of killing some time hanging out. And then we had made plans for later that night to attend a friend's house party, a guy that we had gone to high school with. Hadn't seen him in, a couple years. So we was like, oh, this would be great. We get to see him, see a bunch of old classmates. So it's now about, I don't know, 2 or 3 o'clock in the afternoon. I finished that entire fifth of gin by myself. And this was so routine for me every single day, no matter what, like clockwork. I had to go and buy 4 24-ounce cans of Old English. That was my beer. It's like
hmm
8.3%. I wanted to get the most bang for my buck. So I went to the store. I bought the 4 24-ounce cans of Old English. I drank those over the course of the next 3 or 4 hours. So it's now about 8 o'clock. So then my brother and I decided we would go to another buddy's house to kind of hang out. We didn't want to get to the party too early. So we get to that friend's house. The three of us hang out, kill some time. We drink a pint of Hennessy between us. And it's now about 11 o'clock. So we go to exit his apartment to go to the party. And he's living with his mother. So his mother from the kitchen, she yells out as we're walking out the door, now y'all be careful tonight. You hear?
Mm.
And of course, we all replied, yes, ma'am. Yes, ma'am. We'll be careful. We're good. Clearly, we had no intentions of being careful that night because we're already drunk, frankly, and we're driving drunk, right, to the party.
Yeah.
Sadly, this is what we all did every day and never thought twice about it. And so we get to the party, see a bunch of old classmates, we're smoking weed, we're drinking more alcohol, of course. We celebrate the new year. Everything is great. We exit the party at about 12:15. And it's funny, not funny. It's interesting. My brother, just the other day when I was at his house, um, he told me, he said, Martin, he said, because my brother hadn't talked about this, more than a handful of times over the last, 2 decades,
Mm.
um, because it's very traumatic for him, and I'll talk about that a little bit later. But he said, we tried to offer to drive for you that night. I said, you
Mm.
did? Because to my recollection, nobody offered to take my keys or to drive. And he said, "Bro, I'm
Mm.
telling you, we tried to drive for you, and you said you were good." So
Mm.
that was really revealing to me, and he just told me that a couple weeks ago when I was
Wow.
there. So anyway, so we get into my vehicle. I take my friend home without incident. I get back onto the freeway to take my brother home. And I remember how exhausted I felt because I had only had one chicken, three-piece chicken meal from Popeyes the whole day, and I'm drinking all day and all night. So I hadn't had much to eat. I'm exhausted. I knew I didn't have to work the next day because it was a holiday, so I could sleep in. So on the freeway, I'm like, I just want to get my brother home so I can get home and go to sleep. So on the freeway, I began to elevate my speed to about 80 miles an hour.
Mm.
And, this makes my brother nervous. He's like, man, you need to slow down. The police are out, especially, it being a holiday and all. And I thought, well, that's a good point. That does make sense. So I went ahead and slowed down for the time being. We exited the freeway about 10 minutes later. So now we're driving in a residential area down Martin Luther King Jr. Boulevard in Portland.
Mm.
And again, I get, impatient. I just want to get him home. So I start speeding to about 60 miles an hour in like a 30 zone. And this makes my brother angry. And he's like, slow down before we crash. And I tell him, I'm calm down. I know what I'm doing. I've got this. I've done it 100
Done it before.
times,
Yeah.
right? 100 times. But just to, appease him, keep him quiet, I went ahead and slowed down. So we drive for about 10 more minutes, and I'm just about to get into the left-hand turning lane to drop him off at our parents' house. And then in an instant, he realizes he's all out of cigarettes. So he said, "Hey man, let's go up the road so I can get some cigarettes. I'm all out." And in my mind, I'm thinking, "Great, here's one more stop that I don't want to have to make." So we drive for a couple blocks, and then about 2 blocks from that point, there's an intersection, and it's this little mini mart we need to get the cigarettes. It's just beyond the intersection, and so I'm 2 blocks from that intersection, and I'm looking up at the light, and the light is yellow. And as intoxicated as I was, Ray, there was no way I was going to make this light. And I knew that. Like,
Mm-hmm.
like it wasn't that I was so inebriated that I thought, oh, maybe I can make it. I knew I wasn't going to make this light. But I just want to get these stupid cigarettes. I want to drop him off and I want to get home and go to bed. So
Yeah.
I'm not waiting for this light. So I immediately punched the gas. And I remember, I became, so focused on getting through that light, and frankly, I would have sped right past where we needed to get to at that rate of speed anyway. So
Mm.
it didn't make a whole lot of sense. But again, I've been drinking all day and all night, so
Yeah.
all
Yeah.
bets are off. So I speed through the light, and literally within seconds, boom! I mean, just this just earth-shattering crash. And then I remember the airbag, envelops my face, and it feels like I'm being suffocated by a parachute. And then
Mm.
everything seemed to kind of go in slow motion as my car, kind of comes to a slow winding halt. And my first thought was to make sure my brother's okay. So
Yeah.
I look in the passenger seat. He's starting to move a little bit. So I'm relieved that we're both alive. This is good. A guy on foot comes rushing up to the driver's side door, frantically. Are you guys okay? Are you guys okay? Yeah, we're okay. I tell him. And I step out of my vehicle. Now, you got to realize at this point, I'm still very, very superficial. My prized possession was my vehicle. It was a
Mm-hmm.
status symbol of success. I'm still very much in that mind frame that all these external things validate me. And
Yeah.
so I'm walking around my car and I'm looking at my custom rims that are utterly destroyed. The entire front end is smashed inward. And like my heart is broken because my prized possession is now in a heap of crumpled metal.
Yeah.
And then my brother gets my attention and he starts to point across the street where the car had spun about 60 or 70 feet before it stopped. And he said, man, I think I see somebody lying down on the pavement over there, and it does not look like they're moving.
Mm.
And so when he told me that, like just this flood of kind of the realization of the magnitude of what I had just done comes sweeping
Mm-hmm.
over me. And I'm like, oh my God, what have I done? And of course, within seconds, lights and sirens are everywhere, rushing to the scene. And so the policemen are there, the first responders, the firemen are trying to extract whoever else is in that vehicle carefully from that vehicle. And I remember the officer was asking me, have you been drinking tonight? How much have you had? And I'm trying to be totally compliant. Like I feel terribly about what I just did. So
Mm-hmm.
I'm saying, yeah, I've been drinking. I probably shouldn't have been driving, and I ran through the red light. Like from a legal standpoint, your attorney would say, don't say any of that, right?
Sure.
But this is a human moment, and I'm just like, oh my God, I feel so terrible about what I just did. And so about 5 minutes into that interview, 5 or 10 minutes into that interview, that officer confirmed to me, what I had really in my heart of hearts known to be true, which was that person who was lying on the pavement had perished.
Man.
And he told me that another passenger was being driven to the trauma center just blocks away. And
Mm.
so I'm placed under arrest. I'm put into the back of the cruiser and we head for downtown for processing. Now, mind you, I'd already done time in prison, so I know, Ray, I know like I am going to go to prison for a really long time. I
Yeah.
knew that Oregon had mandatory minimum sentencing laws for any what's considered a person-to-person violent crime. And I very much knew that manslaughter in the first degree was anytime you're impaired and you kill somebody in a crash. That is manslaughter in the first degree. And I know that. And so I know at this point, at least I'm doing 10 years because one person has passed away. I know another person is in critical condition at least. And
Yeah.
so I'm driving past my parents' house in the police car because this happened just 4 blocks from my parents' house. And I take one last look down the street and I know like I am not going to see that house for at least 10 years.
Yeah.
Now, 10 minutes into this interview, the ride downtown, Ray, I'm listening to the police radio because there's a lot of back and forth, about the crash, as you can
Sure.
imagine. And about 10 minutes into that ride, I could hear it, at least what sounded like. What came over the police radio was that there was another passenger who had been pronounced dead at the scene. And so I asked the officer, I said, excuse me, sir. I said, did I just hear that correctly? Did they just say that someone else was in that vehicle and they didn't make it? He said, unfortunately, yes.
Mm.
So now I know that I am going to prison for roughly 20 years, day for day. I'm 24 years old and like, this is my life.
Hey guys, I hope you're enjoying the episode. If you are, we'd really love it if you could leave us a rating and a review on Apple Podcast or a rating on Spotify. And of course, please feel free to invite somebody into the conversation. If you feel like you have a story to share on the podcast, why not apply to be a guest? You can do so by completing the form on the podcast description or find it on stackanddays.com. That's stacknday's.com. But for now, let's jump back into the conversation. Man, man, you know, obviously, you know that that's an extremely um, heart-wrenching story to hear. I can see you, recounting it, and I'm sure you've done it hundreds of times at this point. It sounds like as though it's still very much alive, in you. Even having been so long ago, uh, I can just only imagine the fear. I can only imagine the things that are flowing through your mind, the shame, like all of that, and I mean, again, my job is to keep things moving on this, and I've heard your story, but to hear it, face to face with you is incredibly impactful and incredibly powerful. So let me try to get back on track here. Uh, what happens at that point, right? You are in the cruiser. Obviously, you go through processing, you go through the courts, you have a reckoning with your family, I'm sure. You have a reckoning at some point with the family of the victims. And in addition to that, you are now, certifiably behind bars for the next 2 decades. So talk to me about what the next chapter and how that unfolds for you.
Sure. So, in order to kind of set that up, I have to take you to about 3 or 4 days after the crash happened. So,
All
everything
right.
is still fresh. And I am in my cell and I'm minding my own business. And someone had slid the Oregonian newspaper underneath my door. And I couldn't understand why. I didn't ask anybody to see a paper. I figured there must be something important in there for me to read. So, I picked this newspaper up, began to thumb through it, and I see my picture on the front page of one of the sections. And I began to read this article. And with each paragraph that I read that morning, for the first time in several days, my faceless victims became people.
Hmm.
And these people had an incredible story.
Yeah.
And their story was that they were in long term recovery. One has 16 years clean, one has 17 years clean and sober. They were active in the recovery community in Portland. They worked for Volunteers of America. They volunteered with Mothers Against Drunk Driving. They would watch women's children so that ladies could attend AA and NA meetings on a regular basis. They were pillars in the recovery community. The night that this happened, Ray, they were returning home from a clean and sober New Year's Eve party at the convention center in
Hmm.
Portland when they were struck and killed by a drunk driver. And the columnist, he had highlighted he called it a palpable irony, which is what I named my first book, Palpable Irony, for that reason. He said it is a palpable irony that the folks who had devoted their lives to help people get clean and sober would have theirs cut short by a drunk driver.
Hmm.
And then he said something at the end of that article that changed my life forever and set everything into motion for the next, what would be 17 and a half years in prison. He said, perhaps the person they will have ended up helping the most is the man who's charged with killing them.
Hmm.
And it was such a heavy statement, right? I'm 3 or 4 days into this saga, and I'm 24 years old, and I know I'm going to go to prison for roughly 20 years day for day. So I couldn't fully like understand and appreciate the essence of what he had said, but I also knew it was something I could not ignore. Like it was so profound and it hit so deeply. And so for the next several months, by this point, I had gotten back to my Christian roots, and I'm reading the Bible and I'm praying and I'm, having this fellowship with a few guys on the unit. And I'm meditating on that phrase, to try to ascertain how I was going to apply those words to my life. And then
Hmm.
it finally came to me one day that the only way this tragedy will not be in vain is if I carry on the legacies and literally make it my life's mission to do everything I possibly can to help others who are struggling, right, in addiction, with mental health issues, and to prevent this from ever happening. So in that moment, I vowed to do that. I didn't know what shape that would take while in
Yeah.
prison. I didn't know how long I was going to be in prison. I knew it was going to be a long time, and so that became my focus. That was my mission. That was my purpose. So I take a plea bargain for 17 and a half years a few months later. And this is day for day. You cannot earn a single day off for good behavior, for working a job, for getting an education. It is day for day, 210 months. See you later. So I get
Hmm.
to state prison. I, I figure if I'm gonna honor this mission to help others who are struggling, I probably should get an education and go into counseling, right? So I get to state prison. At the time, I find out they're offering you could take one college course per semester for like $25 each. So I say, okay, let me start there. So I start to take these college courses, and I'm getting A's, I'm getting B's, I'm starting to gain confidence in my ability. I'm starting to take studies, African American studies, which made me want to then read other books about African American civilization, ancient civilization, and I'm learning so much about our people that I
Hmm.
had not, like, I had only heard about slavery and Martin Luther King and Rosa Parks, but like there's so much more that was out there that helped to frankly shape a healthy identity as a
Right.
black man in America. Like, I'm really starting to feel good about myself as a black person for the first time. And
Mm.
so it was much more than just a formal education for me. It was really a this it helped to ignite this internal process of establishing a healthy identity, a healthy self-concept, which would lead to healthier self-esteem. And so I thrust myself into that. And then about 3 years into my sentence, my dad passes away.
Mm.
But my dad made sure that all of his hard work for all those years would help his kids when he wasn't here. And so what that meant was I was able to get a portion of his pension along with my brother and my sister. And then he also left us life insurance money. And now I have a chunk of money that I'm able to invest into my future. So instead of taking one class here, one class there, now I'm taking classes from major universities via correspondence, from
Hmm.
Louisiana State University and Indiana University. And I parlayed all of that into an associate's degree in 2010. And then I got a bachelor's in sociology from Colorado State University in 2013. And then I went on to get a master's in psychology from California Coast University in 2016. And so through this process, I'm like I said, I'm peeling back the layers of my addiction and criminality and kind of those early negative behavioral patterns that I adopted, and
Hmm.
understanding from a sociological standpoint those factors that went into that, and then from a psychosocial kind of individual standpoint and how those things affected me, that all kind of wrapped up into this perfect recipe, if you will, of self destruction, right, and
Yeah.
and addiction for me. And so as I'm learning all these things, now I'm starting to mentor other guys on the yard, right? Because guys saw that the way I did my time was very different than the way a lot of guys did their time, right?
Hmm.
Yeah, I exercise and all that, but I wasn't just all about getting buff and walking around the yard and hey, I'm the tough guy. Like, I went to school, I was a tutor, I went to church, I went to AA, right? And so guys saw that and they're like, man, this guy's different. So now I'm starting to like kind of mentor in an informal sense young guys coming in the system before they would get swept up by the prison culture and gangs and politics and all that. And guys would like open up to me, Ray. I kid you, they would open up to me about childhood trauma. I don't
Mm.
even know if I was, qualified to be hearing these
Right.
conversations, but like they just wanted a safe space to talk about this stuff, talk
Yeah.
about being molested as kids, stuff you don't talk about in prison, right?
Sure.
I mean, in life, but let alone in prison. But guys felt safe with me, and so that kind of conferred to me that, that the counseling is definitely where I need to be. But how can I kind of formalize this, right? So I transferred to another prison in 2016, and I know that even though I have a master's degree at this point, I still need the clinical hours to get certified as a substance abuse counselor. So I talked to the clinical director of a program at the prison and tell them everything that I had done and how much money I invested in my future, and I want to be a counselor. And he was like, "Well, we don't really have a program that can kind of get you certified as a counselor, but because you have done so much on your own already, let me see if I can talk to my boss and see what we can do."
Mm.
Long story short, they cut a bunch of red tape. I still had 5.5 years left at that point. You had to be under a year to get into that program, but his boss, allowed me to enter into the program as a participant first to understand the program and what it's all about, and then I could work as an intern to accrue those clinical hours. Now, it was in that program, Ray, that I actually came to understand the difference between sobriety and recovery.
Mm.
Because frankly, it had been 12 years and I hadn't had a drink, and I got this master's degree and I'm doing these programs. And so for me, I'm in recovery. But no, I just been sober,
Yeah.
right? I didn't understand what internal triggers and external triggers and relapse warning signs. And, I learned about the biopsychosocial spiritual model of recovery and like all these facets that went into maintaining a life of recovery, right? And
Mm.
having it be fulfilling and meaningful and all of that. And so now I'm really kind of getting some momentum. I'm like, okay, I've got my formal education in psychology and sociology. Now I'm understanding what recovery is really about and what it's rooted in. And so now I can really pour into guys. And so I graduated that program 7 months later. Now I'm working as an intern in the program. I'm running the group a couple days a week. I'm facilitating orientations, assessments. I'm doing one-on-ones. I'm getting documentation notes. I'm doing all the clinical stuff. And so that was really, really affirming to me as well, because now my identity is shaped around helping other people in both a formal sense and an informal sense, because I was still just, have conversations with guys on the yard about what was going on, and I was able to give them advice and just listen, right?
Hmm.
And so it was a total 180 in how I was operating in my addiction versus now. Because in my addiction, everything was about me, and my validation came from this superficial lens that I operated through. And I need people to tell me how good I was, right?
Right.
And that's what validated me. But that was fleeting. That's not sustainable validation, right?
Yep.
Now I am giving everything that I've learned, and that my experiences and my education, and I'm pouring that into other guys and making a difference in that way. And that's what validated me. That
Mm.
made me feel good. That made me feel that I had an actual purpose, right? And I wasn't just kind of, wandering through life kind of aimlessly looking for people to tell me how great I am. And so it was this whole shift in my mindset as far as how I was going to use my energy, and what I was going to live for,
Mm.
frankly.
Mm.
And so yeah, that was what got me set on this path.
Man, I think that that's beautiful. You mentioned earlier. I mean, the final line in that Oregonian piece, that the irony was palatable. I mean, not only from the standpoint of the work ultimately that you worked towards, but the fact that you found yourself, you found Martin in prison, where oftentimes people go and lose themselves even more so. You know what I mean? So like the irony of it all, rings extremely, extremely loud in your story. And I mean, I know that that's not lost on you at all. I mean, the fact that you were looking at all that time in front of you, and you took, complete ownership of the days, and then those days strung together as months, and those months strung together as years, and now you're looking at your release, and you have this new lease on your own life that's, I'm sure when you walked in there, probably seemed as though it was over.
Yes, absolutely. When you're looking at 17 and a half years and you're in your early, mid 20s, like it's hard to fathom what life is going to look like when you're 42, right? I went at 24, those numbers were inverse. I got out at 42. And so, but like you said, I had a purpose, I had a mission, I had a focus and a drive, and I kind of kept my head down and plugged away at these different goals. I ended up writing two books and publishing those while I was inside. And then I worked toward my certification. I got certified as a recovery mentor first, and then the following year as a substance abuse counselor. And then around that time, I had also begun to tell my story at DUI victim impact panels inside the prison. So they
Okay.
started a program in 2015, and they would bring in someone from the community who had lost a loved one to a DUI driver
Hmm.
to come in and tell their story. And it was a room, we did it in the chapel, and there was 50. We don't call them inmates anymore. In Oregon, we say adults in custody to kind of get away from that dehumanization. But so there were 50 adults in custody in a circle there voluntarily, some never going home, doing double life, but they heard about this program where people from the community were going to come in and share about how they had lost a loved one to a DUI driver. And then one of us on the inside who was there for that type of crime would tell our story of how we perpetrated this crime, obviously being fully contrite and remorseful and accountable and all of that.
Hmm.
And I'm telling you, Ray, it was such a healing, cathartic, beautiful environment. Like
Hmm.
these people, some people came in and they were hell bent on coming in to tell these guys who are locked up, you know, how bad they are for what they did and how they're harming society. And by the time that meeting was over, there were tears, there were hugs. People got healing
Hmm.
from those spaces, and so I was a part of that for the next several years, and that also kind of affirmed to me that once I got out of prison, I didn't want that. I didn't want my story to stay there in those
In the
spaces. I
prison.
needed
Yep.
it out here as well. And so I got out in June of 21. So it's coming up on 3 years here in a few months. And I knew I was going to be a substance abuse counselor. I put all my energy into that. So I got a job doing that a couple months out with Lines for Life, which is it's a regional nonprofit based in Portland, Oregon. We're mainly known for taking calls on the suicide prevention line, 988.
Hmm.
But then we also, so in Oregon, they had decriminalized small amounts of drugs. And so instead of locking people up, they would give them a citation and then they would call me or one of my colleagues. We would do a screening with them over the phone and then offer them community-based resources. And so that was how I spent my days. However, in my private life, I was really, making a push to get my story out there. And so I started speaking at some local kind of DUI victim impact panels, and then I went on like this whole podcast tour, if you will, because I felt that was like the easiest, quickest way to kind of get my story out there.
Hmm.
And then last year I had the goal to get in front of more live audiences. And so Ray, I can't tell you how many emails I sent to different organizations and schools and colleges and all these different programs. And lo and behold, I started getting some interest. And so to kind of sum it up, last year I spoke at 5 major conferences between Oregon to New York. I spoke at 20 to 25 DUI victim impact panels and alcohol highway safety classes. I did a college tour in New York with the Save a Life tour to speak at several colleges. I've spoken at high schools, and now, and so this year for 2024, I wanted to build on that and to start to create kind of short videos for
Hmm.
programs that are tailored toward adolescents who might just be getting into drugs and alcohol or having some mischief at school or getting in trouble. And so now I've been able to contract with 2 different agencies to create those videos for their audiences as well. And so, and that same mentality, that mindset that I've had out here in the 2.5 years, as far as like setting goals from year to year. I'm not a New Year's resolution guy. I am a goal setting guy with a very pinpointed, firm focus on what I want to achieve, right?
Hmm.
And I know what I need to do to get there. And so that was the mentality that I operated by for 17 and a half years. That's what got me through 17 and a half years of prison,
Hmm.
right? I knew where I was going for the next year. I knew what I wanted to achieve and I knew how I needed to get there. And so I have been so incredibly blessed. And just to kind of cap off, as far as what I'm doing today. So I'm doing the public speaking. I was just promoted 4 months ago at my job to director of cultural engagement. So what that means is, so even though I live in Pennsylvania, I fly to Portland every month. I'm there for a week to 2 weeks. I run a small team. We go into spaces of color
Hmm.
and for instance, we do mental health first aid trainings in barbershops and hair salons and churches because we know that's where a lot of black folks are comfortable talking to people about what's going on in their lives.
Hmm.
And
Hmm.
so we want to make sure that the barbers, the hairstylists, the pastors, the deacons, they are trained in mental health first aid so that they can be able to respond properly and appropriately if somebody's struggling, to be able to ascertain if they're struggling with some suicidal ideation and how to get them connected in the right way, right? So we do this skill building in our community to empower our community to help our community. We have gone into a prison recently, and we're going to go back in April because I am looking to bring mental health first aid training into the prisons as well. Right?
Hmm.
You think about the second largest population of Black folks in Oregon is in prison.
Right.
So we need to reach the community where they are. We do a healing summit. So we do this. We do a lot of cultural engagement work in spaces of color. I use my story as kind of a way to open up and start the conversation, to
Hmm.
destigmatize conversations around mental health and substance use and suicidal ideation, right? And then we have a substantive conversation around that, and then we always bring culturally responsive mental health and substance use treatment resources whenever we show up in those spaces. So it's really come full circle. I am so incredibly blessed for the life that I have. I travel. I've been to the Bahamas. I've been to DC. I've been to Vegas. I've been to many places. And the beautiful thing, Ray, is that I am sober.
Hmm.
I remember what I did the previous day, which is a great thing. And like I embrace life, and life is just so awesome, sober. And so that is my story.
Man, Martin, you know, I feel so filled up with gratitude when I hear you talk about your story, because I can see the gratitude that's coming through in you. Like I look at you and I try to envision what that 24-year-old Martin looks like, what he was thinking about, all those years ago, and looking at you as a fully developed, man who is, quite literally, penning his own life, from this point on. And it's not just because you just got out of prison 2.5 years ago. You've been doing this for a while. You just have an opportunity where there's just more space for you to do it in, right? And I just want to, congratulate you, man, for crawling out of that hole that you were in, and for taking ownership of your life, for taking advantage of all the opportunities that were in front of you, and for the impact that you're making today back into the community that you clearly see, needs it, man. So I just want to give you that shout out directly. I know that you hear this all the time, but I think that you're living a fantastic, perfect, purpose driven life, and I really do appreciate being a part of that, even for an hour and change today, man. I really do appreciate it.
Absolutely, Ray. No, I truly, truly appreciate that. And hearing it from you is different than hearing it from someone else, frankly. And so
Mm.
no, that means a great deal to me. And frankly, I think, when we have gone through different obstacles in our lives, and we find a way to overcome them, I think honestly we have a duty to go
Right.
back to our community to do what we can to try to use those experiences and whatever else we learned along the way, education or otherwise, to help the next fellow man or woman who is struggling. Right?
Yep.
Otherwise, why did we go through all
What
of that?
happened?
Right.
Yep.
Right.
Yep. Contributing back into the culture is key, and it doesn't have to be monumental, but if you can touch one individual, and and give them something that maybe you didn't have or I didn't have, I think that clearly can go a long way, because I mean, that one individual can change the trajectory of someone's entire life, and that, right?
That's right.
Well, and I'm going to finish this off by just asking you two questions that I ask of everyone, and I think that your perspective is going to be just great to hear. One is, for someone who's sitting there, looking at their relationship with alcohol, and don't necessarily know what the first step would be for them to take. You, with all of the experience that you have and all of your training and education, what would you suggest to that individual?
The important thing is that you reach out to someone, whether it be a trusted friend or family member, to say, "Hey, I think I'm kind of, I'm not like I'm not doing well. I'm drinking a little too much. Because even if you're not ready to like go to a formal treatment program or anything like that, at least you have someone to confide in, someone that you trust is going to tell you what you need to hear and not what you want to hear necessarily, right? That's
Yeah.
important. We have a lot of friends and family who, God bless them, they support us, but like they don't always give us the best advice or tell us what we need to hear. So it's got to be somebody who's going to keep it real and be that support, but also kind of be that accountability partner, if you will. But I would hope that even if you started there, that eventually you would actually get with a professional counselor, a
Hmm.
substance abuse counselor. And I will invite anybody, especially folks of color, to reach out to me directly, and I can find some good counseling in your area that is going to be culturally specific. Like that's what I do. And
Clean.
so that way you can be comfortable with the people that you're seeking help from. And so there's that. I'm a member of AA, right? That's what works for me, right? So I go to AA. I do online meetings. I have an app on my phone called Meeting Guide.
Okay.
So I can share that link with Ray. You can put it in the show notes or what have you. But there's online meetings happening all throughout the day. There are in-person meetings depending on where you live. And again, you're connecting with other people who know what it feels like to struggle with this disease, and can give you some support in your journey.
I appreciate that. We'll certainly put that link in the show notes as a resource. Last question I have for you, Martin, is, and I think this is particularly important in our communities, just because sometimes when we figure out somebody's struggling, it's a little bit too late for various reasons. In your experience, how would someone have known that you were in a dark spot, that you were struggling with a lot of things without you having told them explicitly?
Yeah, just the amount that I was drinking. My sister, like when she read my book as an adult, she was like, "Martin, like I thought you just liked to drink. I had no idea you were struggling with these internal things, right?"
Mm,
So she saw the behavior. She just didn't know what was behind the behavior. So if you see somebody who is isolating more, maybe they're not, going out and being with friends or family as much as they used to, or their mood and affect seems to be off, right? Like check on them. Like really check on them. Not, hey, how you doing? Like, hey, how are you doing?
yeah.
Like I'm
Yep.
here. You know what I mean?
Yep.
And so just to be cognizant and mindful, like the behavioral patterns of your friends and family. When you start to see some changes in that, or if you were out with some friends, a friend, and they're drinking a little more than maybe they used to, like get them by themselves, not in front of the whole group, but just say, hey, I've noticed blah blah blah. Are you doing okay?
Yep.
Do you need some help? I'm here. You know what I mean? And so I think that could really go a long way when people know that others are there for them, that they're not going to judge them, but they genuinely care about them and want to support them.
Yeah, I think it's important in our community to call that out, because we oftentimes don't want to touch those conversations because they're also uncomfortable for the person who's making the approach. But we got to do it, because there's too many folks out here who are struggling, feel like they're doing it on their own, because they are not under the impression that there are safe spaces even close by that they can turn to. So I appreciate that, Martin. Where can folks find you, man? I want to make sure that folks can get a hold of you, can obviously learn more about what you're up to, and just like be able to tap into a lot of the amazing things that you're up to these days.
Absolutely. So I'm only on one social media platform, which is Instagram. So it's at Martin L. Lockett. And then my website is martinlockett.com. So those would be the two easiest ways to get a hold of me.
Awesome, awesome. Martin, look, brother, I appreciate you, man. Thank you for coming on to the Stack of Days podcast, sharing your story, for making, all the change happen in your life, and, change happen in the lives of people around you. I mean, you're certainly a blessing. And I know it took a long way to get there for you to feel that, but you're here now, man. And don't ever, 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 ever dim your light, for anybody, because it shines bright. And I think it's extremely important in our world today. So I appreciate you, man.
I appreciate you so much, brother. This was truly an honor. I feel like this is a mama I made it moment. I was on stacking days. So,
Oh,
seriously,
man.
you are doing incredible work for our community, for our people. And I'm just so honored and blessed to have been a small part of it today. So thank you so much for having me.
You got it, brother. All right, everybody. We'll catch you next week on the Stacking Days podcast. Thanks for listening in. I appreciate you guys listening to the Stacking Days podcast. I hope this episode added value to your recovery and wellness journey. Before we go our separate ways, let's connect on social. You can find us on TikTok and Instagram at Stacking Days or via the website www.stackingdays.com. By supporting the show, you can play a direct role in amplifying people of color in their pursuit of recovery. The easiest way to do that is to subscribe or hit the follow button. This way, you'll never miss an episode, all while playing an active part in creating the ecosystem where diverse voices in healing matter. This show is for the purpose of education and connection and is not a replacement for therapy or recovery care. For more information on the resources and support available, take a look at SAMHSA and some other resources shared in the description. Until we meet again, be well, one day at a time.